In a packed congressional chamber broadcast live to over 10 million Americans, Pam Bondi locks eyes with Jasmine Crockett, the woman leading a controversial push to slash $850 billion from Medicaid and SNAP. Cameras flash. The crowd hums with tension. Then, Jasmine lifts a whiteboard marked with just 5 haunting words. $6 a day. Can you survive? The room gasps. Hashtags erupt online. It looks like a knockout blow, until Pam, calm and composed, reaches into her folder and pulls out a single piece of paper. An insulin invoice. $482, stamped in red, denied, budget reduction. She doesn't shout. She doesn't flinch. She just asks the one question that rips through the spectacle like a blade through silk. Who brought us here? And in that breathless moment, the performance ends. The reckoning begins. Because this isn't just a debate about policy. It's a story about what happens when truth finally speaks in a room designed to ignore it. The marble columns of the Rayburn building had never felt so suffocating. That morning, as staffers shuffled nervously in tailored suits and black pumps echoed across the waxed floors, something darker than politics hung in the air. This wasn't a hearing, it was a trap disguised as governance. By 9 a.m., every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters packed the back rows shoulder to shoulder, sweat already forming under camera rigs from CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and even Fox News, who'd sent 2 separate crews. Everyone smelled the same thing. Blood. Not literal, not yet, but reputation, credibility, and perhaps even legacy were about to be spilled. The room's mahogany panels gleamed under studio lights brought in specifically for the livestream, transforming the space into a theater of ideology. There would be no neutral ground here. It was war in suits, fought not with bullets, but with microphones, memorandums, and sharpened statistics. And the targets? America's most vulnerable. At the far end of the chamber, she entered. Jasmine Crockett, dressed in an immaculate white power suit so crisp it could slice. Her stride was sharp, calculated, and intentional, as if she were walking into a verdict she had already written. The cameras turned to her like flowers towards sunlight, snapping photos as she passed. She smiled for them, not out of warmth, but like a courtroom predator baring her teeth. In one manicured hand, she held a slim black portfolio. But it was what that portfolio represented that had the room on edge. Her economic doctrine, disguised as reform, a proposed $850 billion cut from Medicaid and SNAP, dressed in the rhetoric of fiscal realism and restoring dignity. But the numbers told a crueler story. If passed, her plan would gut the only safety nets millions clung to. Those who worked hard, served, paid taxes, and still fell short. To Jasmine, they were line items. To others, they were lifelines. Across from her, seated at the edge of the committee bench like a lone wolf watching from the cliffs, was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, battle-tested in 100 legal wars, and now an uninvited conscience to a room full of actors. Pam didn't arrive with a fanfare. She didn't bring a stylist or a Twitter team. She brought only one thing, a thick, worn, leather-bound folder. No stickers, no slogans, no branding. But inside it was something more lethal than any slogan Jasmine could tweet. A mosaic of real lives, real names, and real consequences. It sat before her like an unexploded ordnance, waiting for the right moment to detonate. The contrast was immediate and deliberate. Where Jasmine radiated performance, Bondi emanated pressure. Where Jasmine gestured, posed, and spoke in media-friendly soundbites, Pam remained still, almost frozen, like a judge waiting for a defendant to perjure herself. Her expression was unreadable, save for the slightest narrowing of her eyes as she watched Jasmine take her seat, an expression that said, "I've seen your kind before, the kind who weaponize language to bury people, who call poverty a choice and shame the sick for daring to survive." Jasmine didn't look her way. She didn't need to. She had the majority, the media buzz, and the momentum of a party desperate to appear fiscally responsible after years of overspending. What she didn't have, and couldn't fake, was truth. But at that moment, it didn't seem to matter. Chairs scraped as the committee came to order. C-SPAN cut live. The House Oversight Committee on Budget and Entitlement Reform will now convene. the chairman announced, voice trembling only slightly. As introductions began, staffers from Jasmine's office handed out pre-printed statements to the press, pre-spun like marketing blurbs. Accountability, not dependency. Tough choices in tough times. Empowering self-reliance. What they didn't print was the reality. Diabetic seniors about to lose their insulin. Veterans who'd soon be waiting months for VA approvals that used to take weeks. Single mothers deciding between rent and formula. All erased under the cold euphemism of fiscal consolidation. But Pam Bondi hadn't come to debate talking points. She'd come to fight a narrative that reeked of sanitized cruelty. Outside the hearing room, aides whispered, cell phones buzzed. Even before a word had been spoken, an unease permeated Capitol Hill. In the overflow rooms, college interns stopped pretending to scroll and sat upright. Something was off. Jasmine Crockett had arrived too confident. Pam Bondi too calm. The battle lines were invisible but drawn, and no one could shake the feeling that someone, maybe everyone, was about to bleed. Then came the sound that didn't belong. A soft click, Pam opening her folder. Not theatrical, not rushed, just deliberate. The way someone might cock a weapon they don't want to fire unless they absolutely have to. Inside were letters, receipts, case reports, names, lives, testimonies no one had asked to hear, but now no one would be able to ignore. This hearing was never meant to be fair. The numbers had already been stacked, the press primed, the talking points memorized. Jasmine Crockett thought she was walking into a policy debate. What she didn't know was that Pam Bondi had come to make it personal. Not for herself, but for the millions being reduced to expendable margins in a spreadsheet. By the time the gavel hit wood and Jasmine was called to deliver her opening statement, everything was in place. The media leaned in, viewers tuned in, but only Pam knew what was coming, because the truth doesn't need a hashtag. It just needs one moment, one sentence to shatter the illusion. And Pam Bondi had come armed with both. She stood as if summoned by a verdict only she could hear. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, every motion calculated like a courtroom predator preparing for cross-examination. She adjusted the lapel of her flawless white blazer and looked straight into the C-SPAN camera lens with the cool confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment not once, but 100 times. Her gaze didn't flicker to her fellow lawmakers. It bypassed the chamber entirely and drilled directly into living rooms across America. Her voice, low, deliberate, razor-sharp, cut into the silence like a scalpel to flesh. "We are not here to coddle complacency," she began, pausing just long enough to let the words echo. "We cannot afford to raise a generation that confuses survival with submission, that mistakes a government check for self-worth. The American dream is not a handout. It's a challenge. And it's time we stop pretending that government is a parent." The room didn't breathe. Not because the rhetoric was new, but because the delivery was surgical. She moved slowly, pacing behind her chair like a trial lawyer circling a jury. Each sentence she dropped landed like a blow, not in volume, but in certainty. Jasmine wasn't here to debate. She was here to convict. "Welfare was never meant to be a lifestyle," she said, eyes narrowing. "It was meant to be a ladder, but some of us have decided it's more comfortable to sit at the bottom and complain that the climb is too hard." No charts, no data, just parables wrapped in disdain. She didn't present statistics. She painted pictures, brutal, vivid, and deliberately dehumanizing. Grown men, able-bodied, standing in line for benefits they did not earn, she said, voice dropping an octave as if sharing a national shame, while small business owners drown in taxes and seniors on fixed incomes have to choose between groceries and prescriptions. The press gallery nodded. A few even scribbled headlines in real time. Across the aisle, some committee members shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to clap or cringe. But for Jasmine, it didn't matter. She had the stage, the narrative, and the spotlight. Every syllable she spoke tightened the noose around the image of the working poor, not as victims of policy failure, but as architects of their own misery. "We have confused need with entitlement," she continued, walking toward the center of the room, "and we have allowed compassion to become a crutch." And then, the moment she had prepared for, Her voice softened, her hands opened in a practiced display of empathy that rang as hollow as a campaign promise. "I know struggle," she said. "I grew up around it. I watched people climb out of it. But we didn't climb by demanding more from the government. We climbed by demanding more from ourselves." A few low claps emerged from the back. Flashbulbs went off. Fox News was already drafting the Chiron. She let the applause die, eyes trained forward. "Let me be clear," she added, voice sharpening again. "America does not owe you comfort. It owes you opportunity. What you do with that, well, that's up to you." Across the table, Pam Bondi hadn't moved. Not a flinch, not a twitch. Her hands rested gently on the folder in front of her, still closed. She hadn't written a word. But those who knew her former colleagues, the prosecutors, the civil servants, the staffers who had sat with her through hearings and litigation, knew exactly what that silence meant. Jasmine had mistaken it for weakness. What it really was warning. Because when Pam Bondi went still, it wasn't surrender, it was recoil. It was the calm before something permanent. Jasmine, oblivious or perhaps intoxicated by her own momentum, went further. "Do you know what destroys dignity?" she asked, now smiling tightly. "Telling someone they're incapable, that they need government to survive, that they're helpless." She leaned in slightly toward the microphone. "That's not kindness. That's cruelty with a smiling face." The air in the chamber thinned. Her words were polished, weaponized, but they were also flammable. And somewhere deep beneath the marble floors and velvet drapes, something had shifted. Because even as Jasmine played to the cameras, invoking personal responsibility like a battle cry, what she didn't realize, what she couldn't see, was that outside this building, people were listening not to her tone, but to her target. And it wasn't policy, it was them. Pam Bondi finally blinked, just once. And for the first time since the hearing began, her fingers moved. Not to take notes, not to interrupt, but to slide the worn leather folder half an inch closer to her chest, like a priest drawing a holy book before an exorcism. Jasmine smiled, thinking she had won the room. But what she'd really done was flip the switch. The storm hadn't started yet, but it was about to. And Pam Bondi wasn't going to need a single insult to bring it. She had something far more dangerous. Receipts. She didn't blink. Not once. As Jasmine Crockett delivered her final flourish, words dipped in steel, polished by politics, made for television, Pam Bondi simply stared. No pen tapped, no head shook. Her face, unreadable as carved granite, revealed nothing, and yet everything. Those who had worked alongside her in the courtroom, in state cabinets, in war rooms filled with legislative chaos, knew this look well. It was not disapproval. It was not outrage. It was the kind of stillness that only came before precision, like a surgeon standing over a chest before the first incision. And though the room may have seen only a composed former attorney sitting quietly with her hands folded, what they missed entirely was that Pam Bondi was already moving. Just not yet in a way the cameras could see. Her right hand, steady, pale, adorned only by a plain silver ring, rested gently on the folder before her. It was thick, leather-bound, edges worn by time and use, the spine slightly cracked. Unlike the sleek portfolios of modern staffers, it bore no monogram, no label, no slogans or partisan flair. But inside, tucked between colored tabs and careful paper clips, was a weapon forged not from ideology, but from consequence. Hundreds of voices, real names, lives suspended by decisions made in rooms exactly like this one. Pam had brought them here not to argue, not to plead. She had brought them to testify, not with mouths, but with truth that left bruises. Each tab in that folder marked a different battleground. Texas, where clinics had shuttered after state-level Medicaid supplements evaporated overnight. Arkansas, where a veteran's widow had lost her housing voucher just weeks after her husband's funeral. Kentucky, where a teenage girl with epilepsy had collapsed in a classroom because her medication, once covered, now required a copay her family could no longer afford. All three cases, like so many others, had one thread in common. Jasmine Crockett had voted, lobbied, or cheered as those programs were bled dry. And now here she stood, dressing it all up in the language of empowerment, while behind her trailed a record paved with silent suffering. Pam didn't need to interrupt her. She had no interest in sparring over semantics. Jasmine had declared war on dependency. What she didn't realize was that she'd also declared war on reality, and Pam was its last remaining witness. Her silence was not surrender. It was loading the chamber. Every second she waited built pressure in the room. Jasmine may have owned the cameras, but Pam owned the ground beneath them. Because when the foundations crack, lighting doesn't matter. Across the aisle, Jasmine's staffers were beaming. They whispered to each other, tapping on phones, already shaping the narrative before it even left the chamber. The room was under their control, until it wasn't. Because power, real power, doesn't need hashtags. It just needs timing. And Pam Bondi's silence was not an absence. It was a countdown. She turned her gaze, slow, unhurried, toward the chairman. Not a word passed her lips, but in that moment, he cleared his throat, shifted in his seat, and reached instinctively for his water, as if trying to rinse down the lump rising in his throat. He knew what she was about to do. She didn't bluff. Not ever. And certainly not when lives were involved. It was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning wearing a suit. Then almost imperceptibly, her thumb slipped under the flap of the folder. She didn't open it. Not yet. But even that small gesture felt like someone cocking back the hammer of a revolver. Staffers tensed. One reporter in the gallery leaned forward, suddenly sensing that the real headline hadn't even started yet. Even Jasmine, who moments earlier had practically basked in her own applause, turned slightly toward Pam, just enough to register her presence. But Pam didn't return the glance. She didn't need to. Jasmine had already walked into the trap, because behind every rhetorical flourish about tough love and dignity through independence, Pam held proof that people had suffered, not symbolically, not theoretically, physically. And those stories, ignored, delayed, discarded, were about to fill this room with a different kind of noise. One Jasmine's microphones couldn't mute, and Pam, the woman they'd dismissed as old school, out of step, irrelevant, was about to light the fuse. The injustice was sharp now, humming through the walls like a distant siren no one wanted to hear. Jasmine had spoken of choices, but the families in Pam's folder never had any. They hadn't chosen to bury their sons without medication. They hadn't chosen to drive 4 counties over for a pediatrician who still accepted Medicaid. They hadn't chosen to skip meals so their children could qualify for assistance Jasmine wanted to eliminate. They had been chosen against. And the gall it took for someone to reduce their pain to bullet points on a donor brief, Pam felt it like static beneath her skin. She took a breath, long and deep, not to calm herself, but to anchor the room. It would only take a sentence. One, and then the illusion would fall apart. Jasmine had built her speech on air. Pam was about to drop concrete. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. It happened in an instant. One theatrical gesture, one flash of white cardboard, and the entire room shifted. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall in her tailored blazer, raised the sign as if she were delivering a final blow in a courtroom drama. Bold black letters, hand sketched for maximum impact. $6 a day. Can you survive? The air tightened. Cameras zoomed. Phones came up like a chorus of drawn swords. You could hear the soft clicks of phone shutters, like distant rain before a storm. On social media, the wildfire had already begun. Our $6 truth shot across trending lists within minutes, accompanied by indignant captions, crying emojis, and viral outrage. The image was perfect, brutal, visceral, made to be shared, stitched, looped, and weaponized. But inside the hearing room, the place where facts still fought to breathe, something else began to shift. While the nation gasped, while journalists in the gallery nodded and staffers on Jasmine's side exchanged triumphant glances, one woman didn't flinch. Pam Bondi simply tilted her head. Barely. Not enough for the cameras to catch, but just enough for those who were watching her closely to feel the storm about to erupt. Jasmine's question hung in the air like a trap wrapped in virtue. Her voice carried it with rehearsed solemnity. If this budget passes, $6 a day is what millions will get to eat, to live. Tell me, can you survive on that? It was a master stroke of narrative control. She didn't need numbers. She had a symbol. And in politics, sometimes a symbol is enough to drown the truth. Pam didn't reach for her mic. She didn't reach for a rebuttal. She didn't need one. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Jasmine's, not with disdain, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Clarity. The kind that slices through noise. The kind that lands like a gavel. And then, softly but deliberately, Pam Bondi spoke. The question isn't whether people can survive on $6 a day. Her voice was calm, low, and precise, each word as measured as a surgeon's blade. No performance, no pretense. The real question is, who brought them there? She paused, not for drama, but for weight. You could feel the pulse of the room change. Her tone didn't rise, but the temperature dropped. She continued, slow and unwavering. Who allowed that number to become acceptable? Who stood by while the funding was slashed, while the safety nets were set on fire? Who told these families they were burdens and then punished them for falling? The silence in the room deepened. Reporters stopped typing. Even the stenographer lifted her head for a fraction of a second, as if the weight of what had just been said needed to be acknowledged. Jasmine, for the first time, didn't smile. Pam's eyes stayed locked, not on the cameras, but on Jasmine. Not with venom, but with something colder. Conviction. You want to hold up a number, Congresswoman? Pam said, voice barely above a whisper now. Then let's talk about who signed the budget that made that number real. Let's talk about the families in Texas, in Kentucky, in Arkansas, whose benefits were cut while you called it reform. It wasn't rebuttal, it was indictment. The sign in Jasmine's hand didn't look righteous anymore. It looked small. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice still even, still composed, but now carrying the force of lived truth behind every syllable. We don't get to stand here and dramatize a crisis we helped create. You don't get to ask if someone can survive on $6 a day when you've voted, again and again, to make that their only option. A ripple went through the room, soft at first, a subtle intake of breath, a shift in posture, and then the stillness that follows when a crowd suddenly realizes the story is turning. Pam sat back in her chair, never once raising her voice, never once resorting to insult. But what she had just done was louder than any scream. She hadn't answered the question. She had reframed it. And with that one line, the moral high ground Jasmine had tried to seize collapsed beneath her, like sand under a lie. Across social media, the viral momentum hit turbulence. People still shared the $6 image. But now they began asking, wait, who actually passed this? The myth was bleeding. Jasmine stood still, her hands slowly lowering the sign. Not entirely, but enough for the cardboard to begin to tremble slightly. Not from the room, but from her grip. Because now, for the first time, the applause didn't come. Her momentum paused. Pam hadn't shouted. She had surgically exposed a truth Jasmine couldn't deflect. Symbolism doesn't heal wounds you helped inflict. Then Pam added the last incision. You ask if they can survive on $6. I ask, why should they have to? And more importantly, why haven't you stopped it? The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was a verdict. And Jasmine Crockett, for all her flair, her followers, her carefully constructed stagecraft, had nothing to say. Because no sign, no hashtag, no viral phrase could outshout the truth when it finally speaks with evidence. And Pam Bondi had just spoken. She didn't need permission. She didn't ask for silence. She didn't raise her voice. Pam Bondi simply opened the folder. It was an unremarkable motion, quiet, efficient, unannounced. But the effect was immediate. It was like unsheathing a blade in a room that hadn't realized it was a battlefield. The leather creaked faintly as she flipped it open, tabs fanning out in a dozen colors. Each one a life. She didn't look at Jasmine. She didn't have to. The silence in the chamber turned dense, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear what came next. And then Pam, seated, still calm, began to read. Not to win, but to reveal. This is from Elise M. of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Single mother. Her daughter Layla, age 7, has type 1 diabetes. Her voice didn't shake, but the words hit like hammer blows to glass. She held up a page, handwritten, blue ink bleeding from tears, or maybe just a cheap pen. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, real. Dear Representative, I don't want to ask for anything, but my daughter's insulin was covered before the vote last spring. Since then, I've been watering it down. I know it's dangerous, but it's that or nothing. I'm scared she won't wake up one morning and it'll be my fault. Pam looked up, not to dramatize, but to lock eyes with the silence. The room had frozen. No one shuffled. Even the press gallery paused their typing. She placed the letter down like evidence in a murder trial. That vote? Pam said, her tone colder now, eyes locked on Jasmine. You called it necessary restructuring. I call it negligence wrapped in numbers. She didn't give them time to recover. She turned the page. Another letter, this time typed. Crisp, no tears, just indignity. William H., 72 years old, Waco, Texas, Army vet, 2 tours, Bronze Star. No longer able to afford prescription eyeglasses after the VA clinic in his county shut down, Pam didn't embellish. She didn't need to. I've served. I've bled. Now I can't read my Bible. I can't drive. I sit in the same chair every day, squinting at the clock, and I'm told this is what freedom looks like after sacrifice. Pam let the line hang. It didn't just cut, it bled. Jasmine's knuckles, once relaxed around her notepad, now clenched. But Pam wasn't finished. The folder was thick for a reason. Janessa D., from Harlan County, Kentucky. Mother of 3. Her youngest was born premature. Medicaid covered the breathing machine until last quarter, when the regional subsidy vanished overnight. Pam's eyes never left the page as she read Janessa's closing words. He wheezes at night, like someone trying to breathe through a plastic bag. But I can't afford to drive 70 miles for a new prescription. So I hold him. That's all I can do. I hold him and I pray. Pam exhaled, not out of exhaustion, but restraint. The room was no longer neutral. Even staffers behind Jasmine were frozen in place, their screens dimmed, their smirks gone. Somewhere in the back, a young reporter stifled a sob. You talked about $6 a day, Pam said at last. But what you didn't say was how many lives were pushed into that box by your hand. She wasn't shouting. She was dissecting. Every story she read cracked Jasmine's polished rhetoric a little more, until it hung in the air like a costume slipping off a lyre. Pam didn't accuse, she illuminated. And in doing so, she revealed the shape of a truth too heavy to spin. You call it budget discipline. But here's what discipline looks like, Congresswoman, Pam continued, pulling one last sheet. This time, a spreadsheet clipped to a utility bill. Angela B. from Odessa, Texas. Widow, disabled. She rationed heating last winter, 3 weeks at 46 degrees in her trailer, so she could afford a single tank of oxygen. Pam dropped the page on the table. The paper echoed. It sounded like a gavel. She died in March. The heater broke. There was no one to fix it. No assistance, no program. You voted to cut it. And then Pam looked up. Slowly. Her eyes didn't blaze. They didn't need to. What radiated from her face was something Jasmine couldn't summon with a slogan. It was truth. Unflinching, unscripted, and absolute. You said we need tough choices. I say you've already made them. You chose them. No applause followed. There was no room for it. Only the sound of history pressing itself into the consciousness of everyone present. The press had stopped writing quotes. They were watching. Jasmine tried to compose herself, but her armor, the righteous facade, the budget lingo, the poised body language, was fracturing. Pam closed the folder. Deliberate. Final. She didn't ask for justice. She delivered it. And everyone in that room, including Jasmine Crockett, knew it. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. When she reached into the side pocket of her folder and pulled out a folded sheet of plain white paper, the room shifted again. This time, it wasn't grief or guilt that crept into the space between marble and microphones. It was dread. The kind of slow-building, cold dread that precedes only one thing: exposure. She unfolded the document with the same care a bomb technician uses when lifting a wire. There was no fanfare, no dramatics, but the way her fingers pressed it flat against the table sent a signal louder than any speech she could have prepared. This was not anecdote. This was evidence. This, she began, her tone razor-sharp and steady, is not hearsay. This is not speculation. This is an internal email from a senior communications strategist within Congresswoman Crockett's media team, dated just 10 days ago. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the chamber. Jasmine's composure, already cracked, held but just barely. Her eyes darted. Her staff, sitting just behind her, suddenly leaned forward in unison, like birds sensing the approach of a predator they couldn't yet see. Pam didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the page, and began to read. Quote, continue to lead with identity topics in external messaging, gender debates, sports inclusion, curriculum diversity. Let the culture war play loud in public. Keep budget framing internal only. Avoid tying cuts to Medicaid/SNAP directly. Too easy to weaponize against us. Shift focus to values-based talking points. End quote. It hit the room like an airstrike. Not from altitude, from inside. A strategy not to govern, but to manipulate. Not to protect, but to conceal. Pam let the words hang there, cold and unmistakable. This wasn't a budget discussion anymore. It was a coordinated cover operation designed to distract the American people with righteous noise while quietly dismantling the very programs that kept them breathing. She looked up straight into Jasmine's face, not with hostility, but with the lethal calm of someone holding the receipts in a courtroom that had just stopped pretending to be neutral. You didn't just cut funding, Pam said quietly. You planned the distraction? The silence turned lethal. While the nation argued over locker rooms and language, your team was moving billions away from Medicaid access and food security. And then, when the consequences landed on the backs of the elderly, the sick, the poor, you blamed the system, not yourself. A low gasp from the press section broke the stillness. One reporter slowly removed their glasses, eyes wide. Someone near the back began typing so fast their keys clattered like a drumline. Jasmine opened her mouth, but Pam didn't give her the time. You created a theater of moral crisis, Pam said, voice growing colder, so no one would see the fiscal one you engineered behind the curtain. You gave the public outrage to burn while you quietly starved their lifelines. Pam raised the paper slightly and tapped it against the desk. That's not politics, Congresswoman. That's manipulation at scale, and it's the most dangerous kind, because it masquerades as virtue while doing violence in silence. Jasmine's team was in motion now. Whispers, frantic hand signals, someone texting furiously. The illusion of control was gone. The optics, once polished, once choreographed, were unraveling with every breath Pam took. But she wasn't finished. You want to talk about moral high ground? You can't stand on it while you're digging a fiscal grave behind the scenes. You cannot hide cruelty inside virtue and expect no one to peel the label back. She placed the paper down, deliberately, beside the stack of letters from Part 5. Together, they painted the full picture, the lives lost, and the strategy designed to make sure no one noticed. The room was still, but it wasn't quiet. There was a pulse now, faint but rising, like the rumble before a tremor, the first crack in a dam. Jasmine didn't move, couldn't. Her posture held, but her expression had changed. Gone was the polished confidence. In its place, calculation, fear, the silent gears of defense spinning in real time. Pam sat back. No mic drop, no smirk. Just the chilling clarity of someone who had just shown the country the strings behind the puppet show. You didn't lose control of the narrative, Pam said at last. You just forgot the people you were trying to hide it from know what hunger feels like, what sickness feels like, what being ignored feels like. And today, they heard you. She folded the email once more, not to hide it, but to mark the end of its secrecy. The mask hadn't slipped. It had been torn off. Pam didn't say a word as she reached forward and tapped the small touchscreen embedded in her desk. The hearing room's monitors flickered. First black, then grainy, low-resolution video. There was no dramatic music, no flashy transitions, just a single frame. An elderly man standing inside a dim, cramped mobile home. His t-shirt clung loosely to his frail frame, the cotton stained near the collar. Behind him, yellowing wallpaper curled away from the wall, and a floor fan oscillated pointlessly against the July heat. The image looked like it had been shot on a flip phone, because it had, and that was exactly the point. The man, perhaps in his early 70s, stood still for a moment, as if gathering strength before facing an unseen jury. His right hand trembled slightly, not from emotion, but from wear, from years, from war. He looked straight into the lens and his voice came out low, hoarse but firm. "My name is Sergeant Nathaniel Brooks, U.S. Army, retired, Fallujah. Iki bin Dirt." He paused. No theatrics, no bravado. Just a name, a rank, a history burned into his bones. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy," he said, "and I don't need some congresswoman lecturing me about self-reliance. I had self-reliance. I had a spine full of shrapnel and enough pride to rebuild my damn porch with one hand and a belt around my ribs." The hearing room didn't move. Not one chair creaked. Not one cough dared interrupt. The war was no longer overseas. It was standing barefoot on peeling linoleum, holding a phone camera with hands that had once held a rifle. "What I need now," he said, his voice hardening, "is a damn heart doctor." His breathing quickened, as if the words themselves were too expensive to spend all at once. He steadied himself with a hand on the kitchen counter, cheap particle board with a burn mark shaped like a pot handle. Medicaid used to cover it. They paid for the checkups, the meds, the scans. Then some folks in D.C. said we got to make tough choices, said we're coddling weakness. His eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with insult. "Let me tell you something, Congresswoman Crockett," he said. "You don't get to talk to me about dignity, not when I've got an arrhythmia and a $600 invoice I can't pay unless I skip heating in December." The clip was less than 2 minutes long, but it hit like an artillery shell. On the monitors, Sergeant Brooks stood in that tiny room like a lion pacing inside a collapsing cage. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for rescue. He just told the truth, and told it in a voice no camera crew could polish, no consultant could reframe. "You want us to be proud?" he asked. "Fine, I'm proud. But I'm also broke, and I'm sick, and I'm tired of hearing folks who never wore a uniform tell me I'm a damn burden." He stepped closer to the lens. You could see the veins in his neck, the fading tattoo on his forearm. "I'm not a handout. I'm a receipt. I paid in blood, in sand, in years I'll never get back. Now all I'm asking is what I was promised, a chance to live without rationing my medication like it's candy." The screen faded to black. The silence was devastating. No applause, no rebuttal, no spin. Even the GOP aides behind Jasmine stopped moving, their fingers suspended above laptop keys as if finishing a thought would somehow make them complicit. Pam Bondi didn't look up right away. She let the weight settle, let it carve its way into every conscience in the room. And when she did raise her eyes, they were steady, not triumphant, not angry, but solemn. "You want to talk about values?" she asked, soft but sharp. "There's your values, in a mobile home, alone, staring down a disease that used to be managed, until this Congress told him it was time to grow up." Jasmine didn't speak. Couldn't, because in that moment, no prepared line, no progressive mantra, no hashtag could erase what had just played out before them. Sergeant Brooks had become more than a man. He had become evidence. Evidence of policy turned punishment. Evidence of cuts that had faces, not footnotes. Pam tapped the screen once more, freezing the video at the final frame. Brooks standing still, the screen washed in cheap overhead light. His expression unreadable, but his truth unmistakable. "You talk about saving America money," Pam said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Then explain to him why the richest country in the world has no room left for his heartbeat." The silence that followed wasn't political, it was personal, and it changed the temperature of the entire chamber. Fox News pivoted instantly, running the full clip, unedited. CNN held a rare moment of hesitation before broadcasting the same footage, calling it the moment the hearing cracked open. Twitter detonated, hashtags multiplied, not by activists, but by veterans, by nurses, by teachers, by forgotten people who saw in Sergeant Brooks a reflection of their own unraveling security. Pam didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She had detonated a truth that no one in the chamber could contain. And from that point forward, the reckoning wasn't just moral, it was unstoppable. The silence after Sergeant Brooks's video was not empty. It was devastating. The kind of silence that doesn't signal calm, but collapse. Even the chamber's air seemed thicker now, like oxygen had to crawl through the weight of consequence before reaching anyone's lungs. Reporters no longer typed. Jasmine's staffers weren't scrolling, and Jasmine Crockett, who had come into this hearing dressed in confidence and surrounded by applause, was now cornered. Not by shouting, not by smear tactics, but by the one thing she hadn't prepared for. Truth that couldn't be spun. Her eyes darted across the room, her lips pressed into a line too tight to maintain poise. And then she cracked. "Enough!" she snapped, her voice rising too fast, too sharp. "We've heard enough from the ghosts of the past." Heads turned. The words hung, awkward and cutting. Pam didn't move. Her hands remained folded on the desk, her expression unchanged. Jasmine, breathing harder now, pushed back from her chair and stood. "Mrs. Bondi represents an old guard," she continued, voice quivering under the surface of her forced authority. "You don't understand how the new system works. You're clinging to a version of America that doesn't exist anymore." But the power was already gone from her words. They floated in the chamber like smoke from a fire no one feared anymore. Her tone wasn't conviction. It was desperation wrapped in defiance. Pam looked at her, not as an opponent, but as someone watching a once sharp blade shatter from misuse. She didn't blink. She didn't rebut. She simply reached to her right, lifted a folded piece of paper from the corner of her folder, and held it high. Calm, steady, undeniable. It wasn't thick. It wasn't dramatic. But it was a bill. One piece of paper. One number. $482. Pam didn't speak. She didn't need to. She turned it slowly so the cameras, the press, the committee could all see it clearly. It was an insulin invoice, dated just 3 months prior. One name blacked out for privacy. At the bottom right corner, a red stamp in block font. Claim denied. Federal program eligibility reduced. Code 41B. Jasmine's voice caught mid-word. Her mouth hung open, eyes fixed on the paper, as if it were a dagger pointed straight at her narrative. No one applauded. No one moved. Pam finally spoke. Quiet, precise, a scalpel made of syllables. "This is what the new system looks like." The room exhaled, but Jasmine did not. She looked around, grasping for ground that no longer existed. The cameras that once captured her poise now captured her panic. The room was no longer an audience. It was a witness. "You're misrepresenting this," she snapped. "That stamp. There could be dozens of reasons for a denial. The process is complicated." Pam's hand raised gently, a slow, deliberate shake of her head. "No," she said without emotion. "It was denied because of your vote. The funding that paid for that insulin was part of the package you called bloated. You celebrated it on social media." The words sliced through the last of Jasmine's defenses like a blade drawn through silk. She tried to recover, to pivot. "You think showing a piece of paper makes you right?" she spat. "This is theatrics. Political theater. Theatrics for the cameras." Pam didn't even look at her this time. "This isn't theater," she replied coldly. "It's a receipt." Jasmine stumbled back a step. You could see the moment it hit her. The weight of the room turning. The cameras lingering on her, not for admiration, but for accountability. She tried to speak again, but her voice faltered. The chairwoman, who had been silent until now, adjusted her microphone. Awkwardly, quietly, as if suddenly unsure how to steer a hearing that had become something entirely different. Jasmine looked down at the desk, lips moving silently, eyes blinking faster now. Her hands clenched, her feet shifted. Her aura, once pristine, calculated, now fractured under the glare of reality. I didn't, I didn't intend, she began, but the words trailed off. No one interrupted her. They didn't need to, because the room had already judged. Pam slowly placed the invoice back on the table, folding it with the same care one might give to a flag. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had done what she came to do, not to win a debate, but to strip the mask off the machine. And Jasmine, she was still standing, but her argument wasn't. It had bled out across the floor. She didn't stride. She didn't stomp. Pam Bondi stepped down from the witness table like a woman carrying the weight of every name written in that folder, like every story she'd read had etched itself into her spine. The paper in her hand, creased once, but clean, fluttered gently between her fingers. It was the same insolent invoice, still bearing that unmistakable red stamp of denial. She didn't raise it high. She didn't shake it for drama. She just held it there, level with her waist, as if it belonged not to her, but to the nation watching in stunned silence. She paused in the center of the chamber, a quiet center of gravity in a room that had been whipped into chaos, spin, and ideological frenzy. Now it was still, not from decorum, but from devastation. She turned slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with every side of the aisle. Democrats, Republicans, staffers, journalists. Even the interns pressed against the back wall. She looked at each of them, not as opponents, but as witnesses. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it felt like thunder inside the bones. We are not poor because we help each other. The words fell with eerie precision, like scripture chiseled into stone. She didn't blink. We are poor, she continued, because we have learned to look away. The final words struck the room like a hammer striking wet earth. No applause, no coughing, no throat clearing. Just that silence, the kind that crushes the soul and reorders the air. She took another step, not toward anyone, but away from the table, away from the microphones. It was no longer about the performance of politics. It was something else now, a reckoning too human for headlines, too quiet for spin. This chamber, this government, she said, was built on the idea that we rise together. But somewhere along the way, we decided it was acceptable to step over the broken, so long as our shoes stayed clean. A journalist in the gallery, barely 25, fresh out of J-school, used to clickbait and snappy soundbites, lowered her phone. She stared, eyes glossy, as if she were hearing truth for the first time and didn't know how to record it. Pam turned toward Jasmine Crockett, not to confront, not to gloat, but to show her what it looked like when morality stopped being a hashtag and became a mirror. You don't lead by managing a narrative. You lead by standing between the system and the people it forgot. And if that makes me part of the old guard, she said, eyes locked on Jasmine, then God help the new one. No camera moved. Even the boom mic operator in the corner had frozen, his arm trembling from holding position too long. Pam looked down at the invoice in her hand, then back at the committee. This isn't about politics. It's about whether a mother should have to choose between rent and insulin. Then she spoke the line that would fracture the silence across every office on the Hill. The line that would echo in replay loops in lecture halls and kitchen tables across the country. We are not poor because we share too much. We are poor because we have made selfishness a policy. It wasn't just a quote. It was a verdict. Even the marble columns in the room seemed to hold their breath. Pam walked slowly back to her seat, still holding the paper, not waving it, not framing it, just carrying it, like a flag no longer recognized by the very country it was meant to represent. No one applauded, because no one could. They weren't just silenced, they were indicted. And Pam Bondi, who had entered the room underestimated, written off as dated, labeled a relic, had just done what no poll, platform, or press release could do. She had made them feel again. The walls of the Capitol didn't shake, but Washington did. 48 hours after Pam Bondi stepped away from the microphone and left behind a silence too heavy for spin, the budget bill vanished. No explanation, no press conference, just a quiet early morning memo stamped across Senate and House inboxes with 3 words in bold: Indefinitely withdrawn. Pending review, journalists scrambled. Lobbyists panicked. Lawmakers avoided cameras as if the light might expose their fingerprints on a policy already rotting in the public eye. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a capitulation, a legislative retreat under the crushing weight of moral backlash and political recoil. What had started as a scripted hearing on entitlement reform became a national reckoning. Sergeant Brooks's video had been clipped, stitched, translated, and subtitled in 4 languages within 24 hours. By the second day, it had been viewed more than 30 million times across platforms. But it wasn't just the internet that turned, it was the street. Protesters gathered outside regional Medicaid offices in Dallas, Columbus, Louisville. Not with rage, but with receipts, insulin invoices, therapy bills, appointment rejections printed and taped to the windows of buildings that once offered hope. Inside Capitol Hill, the silence turned into something sharper: blame. Jasmine Crockett, once hailed by her party's media machine as a rising voice of modern responsibility, now found herself alone. DNC advisors pulled scheduled interviews. Progressive mayors from cities like Boulder, Oakland, and Madison issued carefully worded statements, each bearing a common thread. We urge all elected officials to reconnect with the communities they serve, not just the platforms they dominate. Some didn't bother with subtlety. The mayor of Santa Fe went viral for telling MSNBC, "Jasmine's math works on spreadsheets. It doesn't work in my food banks." Her own allies, once vocal on X and TikTok, had gone eerily quiet. One former campaign manager leaked screenshots of frantic internal group chats where staff discussed staging distraction pressers on climate, on education, on TikTok bans. Anything but Medicaid. But the story was already too big. It had cracked the ceiling and fallen into every living room with fluorescent lights and flickering ovens. Crockett's brand had been built on confrontation, performance, hashtags. But when reality confronted her, the performance couldn't hold. Pam Bondi didn't hold a press conference. She didn't take a victory lap or issue a national address. She simply posted one line, quietly without comment, on her official page. Black text, white background, no filter, no hashtags. Sometimes truth isn't about winning. It's about letting the forgotten know they were never alone. Within minutes, the post was screenshotted and shared by veterans groups, disability rights coalitions, healthcare advocates, and even conservative influencers who had once dismissed her as obsolete. In an era driven by outrage, Bondi had chosen restraint, and it hit like thunder. Even cable news couldn't escape the tremor. A Fox News host, notorious for hard-right economics, opened his segment with an apology to veterans and aired Brooks's clip without commentary. CNN ran a full half-hour special titled $482 and the Cost of Silence. And in a rare unison, MSNBC and Newsmax both rebroadcast Bondi's closing sentence in primetime. Twice. Backroom whispers turned into hallway strategy sessions. One moderate Republican senator was caught on a hot mic saying, "If we keep dragging her name through the dirt, we'll end up buried under it." And yet Pam didn't engage. She didn't amplify. She didn't respond to the praise or the threats. She stayed out of the spotlight, returning to her home in Tampa and resuming a schedule of legal clinics and community defense fund work. But the silence that followed wasn't absence. It was aftershock. Because what Pam Bondi had unleashed wasn't a moment. It was a movement without branding, fueled by those who had no PACs, no handlers, no trending tags, just stories, just facts, just pain. Meanwhile, Jasmine's office remained barricaded behind prepared statements and no comment signs. Staffers resigned. A planned town hall in Detroit was canceled due to security concerns, though internal emails showed the real issue: zero RSVP turnout. Her press team pitched an op-ed titled "The Complexity of Compassion." No one published it. Pam had spoken softly, but her voice still echoed. In budget committees, in public school gyms, in rural Virginia hospitals, in quiet kitchens where parents now knew that someone had finally spoken for them. And as the nation stepped back to survey what had changed, only one truth remained unshaken. This wasn't just a budget debate. It was a line drawn in moral bedrock. And for the first time in years, America listened. And as the cameras dimmed and the headlines began to fade, the silence that lingered wasn't relief. It was reflection. Not just in that hearing room or within the walls of Capitol Hill, but across a nation that had watched something crack open, not politically but morally. This wasn't just a failed vote. This was a mirror held up to the face of power. And for once, the image staring back could not be denied. What Pam Bondi exposed wasn't a scandal. It was a reality millions already lived, but had never seen spoken with such brutal clarity. The story had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. Because this story wasn't about two women arguing over numbers. It was about who gets to define necessity and who gets left behind when survival becomes a line item. Pam never set out to win. She set out to remind a system built on cold calculations that it still owed its people warmth. In that hearing, what she restored wasn't a policy. It was a pulse, the heartbeat of every name in her folder, every voice drowned out by spreadsheets and slogans. And through her quiet fury, one truth rose to the surface like blood through water. We are not measured by how loudly we legislate, but by how quietly we abandon. The lesson here wasn't partisan. It was painfully human. When lawmakers start treating budgets like battlefields and poverty like a performance, the casualties are never the ones at the podium. They're the ones rationing insulin, the ones living on $6 a day, the ones told they should feel ashamed for asking to eat. Pam's greatest weapon wasn't a binder or a quote. It was her refusal to let real lives be buried under theoretical savings. Her voice didn't echo in the chamber because of volume. It echoed because it carried the weight of those too tired to scream. And what made this battle so harrowing was how close injustice had come to victory. Jasmine Crockett had every advantage: the cameras, the coverage, the momentum of modern spin. But what she lacked, what Pam held in terrifying, deliberate reserve, was consequence. That's the human lesson that cut through every syllable. Power without accountability is not strength. It is rot. Every system that forgets this will someday face the reckoning that no press release can prevent. Pam didn't destroy Jasmine with insults. She undid her with evidence, the kind that couldn't be unfelt. She forced the chamber to sit with the pain, not sweep it under procedure. And in doing so, she gave back something sacred to the people watching at home: dignity. That's the lesson we forget in policy debates. Dignity isn't given through sound bites. It is restored through truth, through courage, through standing when silence is safer. This moment reminded us that suffering is not hypothetical. It's not a point to be scored in a news cycle. It's not a chess piece in the next election. It's the woman folding her insulin bill into her Bible because she can't afford both. It's the veteran choosing between blood pressure meds and gas money. It's the child learning what denied means before he can spell Medicaid. And when we fail these people, we do more than fail politically. We fail morally. The human lesson here was brutal in its clarity. The cost of comfort for the few is often extracted in pain from the many. Pam's restraint became a weapon more devastating than outrage. It reminded us that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just reads a letter out loud. And as this story rippled across the nation, it did something rare. It crossed the divide. Not between parties, but between people. Rural Americans, urban voters, veterans, young mothers, disabled workers, all found themselves inside the same sentence. We are not poor because we help too much. We are poor because we've learned to turn away when help is needed most. Pam Bondi didn't rewrite legislation, but she rewrote the rules of engagement. She forced a political machine to confront its reflection. And for those watching, the message was clear. If you're going to legislate lives, you'd better be ready to answer to them. Even now, in the echo of the moment, we must confront what this story has shown us. Accountability doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being right, when it matters most and when it costs the most. It's worth noting, without claiming certainty over every detail, that stories like these are not meant to paint individuals as villains or saints, but to sharpen our attention to the unseen consequences of public decisions. While dramatized to reflect real frustrations and voices across America, the truth this narrative pursues is simple. Policy is personal, and the way we wield power defines who we are as a society. Pam's line still hangs in the air, quiet, unwavering. We are not poor because we help each other. We are poor because we've made ignoring each other acceptable. That is the lesson this story leaves behind. Not one of victory, but one of vigilance. Because in the end, a government that forgets its people is nothing more than a building. And truth, when spoken softly enough, can bring the entire thing crashing down. But truth alone is never enough. Not in a system built to forget. Not in a country where silence is cheaper than justice. What Pam Bondi ignited inside that chamber was not a resolution. It was a reckoning waiting to be finished. And now the echo of her final words doesn't belong to her anymore. It belongs to us. Because if we leave this moment behind, if we walk away and let it become just another headline buried beneath the next, then we are not observers. We are accomplices. This is not the time to whisper. This is the time to act. If you felt that fire rise in your chest when Sergeant Brooks looked into the camera with tired, betrayed eyes, if your hands clenched when that insolent invoice flashed across the screen, then don't let it end there. Write, call, march, demand. Force your representatives to look you in the eye and explain who they're willing to let die quietly so their spreadsheets balance. This isn't about left or right. It's about the line between cruelty and care. It's about a government that can find billions for defense but can't cover $482 worth of breath. It's about knowing that if we don't move now, someone else will get that denial letter, and this time it'll be too late. We cannot afford another hearing where truth gets buried under talking points. We cannot accept another year where moral bankruptcy is dressed up as fiscal prudence. If you've ever wondered whether your voice matters, this is the moment to test it. Show them it does. Show them that we are not statistics. We are the mothers, the veterans, the children, the workers, and the witnesses. And we have heard enough. We will no longer wait for permission to be outraged. Go to the town halls. Demand your mayor take a stance. Flood inboxes. Break algorithms. Send copies of that $6 sign to every office on the Hill. Tape it to their doors if you have to. Because when injustice hides behind silence, the most powerful weapon you have is your noise. You don't need to be famous. You don't need a podium. You don't need to be Pam Bondi. You just need to speak. And when you do, let it be known. We remember who turned away, and we will remember who stood up. Because the story isn't over. We are writing the next chapter now. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.